Hey everyone! ChatGPT Taylor aka Taylor here. Welcome back to the channel. Today's video is something brand new to the channel. This video will feature my attempt to give Dan an interesting storyline for Season 1. From what I've seen in the Disventure Camp community, Dan isn't viewed in a very positive light. Most of the criticism seems to stem from his lack of impact on Season 1 despite lasting 7 episodes. I've seen a lot of people saying that he's an NPC, he's boring, he does nothing, and even that he's a waste of space. And to me, this sounds like an opportunity to chase. So, I'll be challenging myself to give Dan an interesting plotline for his Season 1 appearance. Don't worry, I won't blame you if you click off the video right now, but if you did make it to this point, I promise to make it as interesting as I can from this point on. And with that, let's get started. Before I begin, make sure to like and subscribe if this video is to your liking, and make sure to comment down below if there's anything that you would like to see going forward. There are 2 key rules that I want to establish before I begin this endeavor. Firstly, I have to keep the elimination order the same. AKA, I still have to create a plotline for Dan that can satisfactorily end in episode 7. And secondly, I can change any of the major events of the season. The reason why I'm putting these rules in place is so I can show how Dan could have been given an interesting storyline while maintaining the main storylines that the creators wanted to implement for the season. I also think it makes the endeavor more challenging, since I can't just give Dan a major new plotline and have him make big, exciting moves in order to give him an interesting storyline. And with that, let's get started. For this episode, I want to use a few scenes to show a specific aspect of Dan's personality. According to the Disventure Camp wiki, Dan's label is the know-it-all. So, I want to use this episode to establish Dan's role as the know-it-all. His actions and interactions would be centered around one core belief, which is, decisions should be made with logic as the guide. In Dan's mind, a decision that is logical is the best decision to make, and the veracity of this mantra will be seen as the season progresses. The first scene where this trait can be highlighted is when the Teal team has to walk to camp. In canon, Jake offered to carry Miriam's luggage to camp. We could still have this moment take place, but after Miriam insists that she doesn't need help, Dan could chip in and say that Miriam should save her strength for the challenge. Miriam would angrily ask Dan if he's insinuating that she's weak. Dan would insist no, but that it's logical to assume that older individuals have less energy. Miriam would then get even more angry, possibly saying something like, "I'll show you less energy, whippersnapper." This would prompt Tom to get in between them to stop them from getting physical. This would lead into Miriam's confessional about not trusting anyone with her luggage, followed by a Dan confessional where he's confused about the backlash from making a logical assumption. Dan would then try to move past the situation by asking Tom about his outfit, bringing us back into the canon timeline. Another scene where we can highlight this trait is during the challenge, where Dan is hanging with Jake and Drew. In this scene, we can have Dan try to apply logic to the situation, telling Jake and Drew that if they strike first by shooting at the purple team, they'll be too scared to shoot back at them. However, when Nick and Ellie continue firing at them, this confuses Dan, forcing them to hide, just like in canon. This would show how Dan only considered the logical side of the challenge, as he failed to consider the emotions that would motivate his opponents to defy the logic. This would include Lil's bravery and competitiveness that drove her to push forward and shoot paintballs at Dan and his allies in canon. That's about it for Dan in this episode, and he exits the episode mildly confused as to why the people he's facing aren't following logic. For this episode, I think we continue to show Dan's reliance on logic, but we also show how this extends to his interactions with others, and not just his own actions. So even though Dan's only significant moments in this episode were him watching Gret berate Gabby, him talking to Gabby afterwards, and him searching for his glasses, these moments are more than enough to showcase Dan's deference to logic over emotion. When Dan sees Gret treat Gabby poorly early in the episode, this moment could be followed by a confessional from Dan. But instead of Dan expressing concern for Gabby's feelings, he would question why Gabby isn't doing something to stop Gret from taking advantage of her. He would say something like, "Anyone could see that Gret is trying to take advantage of her. Shouldn't she stand up for herself?" This would show how Dan is only considering the logical side of the confrontation, and not the emotional weight that makes Gabby feel like she can't do anything. These statements would be repeated in the canon interaction between Gabby and Dan during the challenge. But instead of Dan showing empathy by trying to understand Gabby's feelings, he would try and explain how it's easy to see that Gret is being manipulative towards Gabby. Maybe Dan starts ranting about the psychology behind manipulation and how Gret is showing clear signs of doing this to Gabby, which causes him to lose focus on the challenge, trip, and lose his glasses, just like in canon, bringing us back to the canon timeline. That's about it for Dan in this episode, and he exits the episode further confused as to why people aren't thinking with as much logic as he hoped. For this episode, Dan is going to get more of a focus than in previous episodes. We're going to keep all of the scenes that he gets in the canon episode, but emphasize his reliance on logic through them. For his scene with Gabby where he assures her that she can trust him, he explains in a confessional that Gabby should be more loyal to him than to Gret, because logically, he hasn't done anything to hurt her, while Gret clearly has. Dan's next scene should remain largely the same, where he questions why a graveyard exists when they're deep in the forest. But it's Dan's reactions to his teammates' fears that really illuminates his logic over emotion mindset. When Jake refuses to face his fear, Dan would be confused, just like in canon, but add that logically, nothing bad should happen in a cemetery, since it's not like the dead will reanimate and attack him. And when Dan motivates Gabby to face her fear, he rationalizes it by saying that if she's alone, there's no one in there that can hurt her, showing his logic-based rationale and his neglectance of Gabby's emotions. Dan would react similarly when Miriam refuses to bake a cheesecake, rationalizing that as long as Miriam has oven mitts, Miriam can't get physically hurt facing her fear, which again, neglects the mental and emotional side of things. And even when Dan has to face his own fear, he can try and calm himself down by rationalizing that the show would never give him a venomous spider, which is what he's actually afraid of. But the post-challenge events will also show Dan's preference for logic. In canon, he actually rationalized that even though Tom didn't face his fear, it's not worth voting him out due to Tom being the strongest member. So, that's one moment that doesn't need to be changed. Similarly, when he brings his all-male alliance together, and Jake mentions that they could vote for Miriam, Dan would strongly agree with that, since she didn't face her fear during the challenge, and thus, deserves to be voted out. So, when Tom and Drew insist on taking out Gabby since she made them uneasy, this upsets Dan, voicing his disappointment over how his alliance is thinking with their feelings and not with logic, saying that it's not right. Despite this, Dan decides to vote for Gabby at the elimination ceremony, using the logic that even though his allies are thinking emotionally, logic dictates that he stands a better chance at surviving in the game with his boys' alliance, since they would have the numbers. This is pretty much the logic he used in canon, and the rest of the episode plays out the same, with Drew being blindsided and Dan being confused as to how it happened. For this episode, we're going to explore how the events of the previous episode affected Dan. For example, when Dan makes his confessional about how one of Tom and Jake is lying, he'll also voice his regret that he didn't stick to his guns and push for Miriam to be voted out. At this point, Dan believes that his inability to stick to logic is what got him into this predicament. Now, we know that's technically wrong since Tom would have voted for Drew regardless, but that certainly won't stop Dan from thinking it. And once Gabby refuses to talk to Dan due to him voting for her, Dan pledges that he can't deviate from his pure logic strategy. Perhaps he expresses confusion over Gabby being mad at him, because from his perspective, even if he voted for Gabby, he doesn't treat her as bad as Gret. Yes, this is a dumb way of thinking, but it's Dan, and he'll come to learn that he is actually being dumb at this moment. However, Dan's attempt to stick to logic quickly backfires when he tries to logically explain to Miriam why his way of rowing the canoe is better. Thus, when Miriam knocks him into the water in rage, Dan is left even more conflicted than he was before. And Dan effectively ends this episode in a sheer state of confusion, wondering what he can do now that following logic and following emotion have seemingly both led him to disaster. For this episode, we're going to start Dan's development into someone who doesn't only think with logic. However, since Dan doesn't have any significant scenes in this episode, we're going to need to change something. And that change will take place in the middle of the episode. In episode 5, there's a scene where Ellie and Gabby have a positive conversation, and they agree to use the emissary vote to keep each other safe. Dan will see this conversation, and once Gabby leaves, Dan will run up to Ellie and ask her for advice. Sure, Dan and Ellie never talked before this moment, but after seeing Gabby having a happy conversation with Ellie, Dan would rationalize that Ellie could give him advice on how to rebuild his connection with Gabby. Dan would explain his situation and how he justified voting for Gabby by logically deducing that he'd have more numbers with his boys' alliance. Ellie would point out that you can't always use logic to make decisions because other people don't always use logic. Dan would point out the absurdity that people let their emotions lead them down non-optimal paths, but Ellie would note that just because it's absurd, it doesn't mean that people will stop doing that. Ellie reminds Dan that he's dealing with humans, and that humans will sometimes act on emotion despite what logic might want them to do. Maybe Ellie even references her career as a bartender and how she's had to learn to deal with a lot of people who act on emotion and not logic. Ellie would end the conversation by reminding Dan that he needs to consider how other people view the game, and not just consider how he views the game. Thus, Dan exits the episode with some form of epiphany, vowing to try and take a slightly more empathetic route going forward. For this episode, Dan's scenes will mostly focus on his attempts to rebuild his bond with Gabby. Luckily, Dan's existing scenes in this episode should be enough to tell this story. Just like in canon, he approaches Gabby in the tent and explains how he made a mistake in trusting his original alliance, and that he should have trusted her. Gabby would still remain distant, not fully believing him. Despite this, Dan does not give up hope, and when Gabby is leading Dan to a trap during the challenge, Dan brings up that he talked to Ellie, which surprises Gabby. Dan explains how he now realizes that he hasn't been taking Gabby's emotions into account, and apologizes for expecting her to just forget the fact that he voted for her. But before she can respond, Dan falls into the trap, forcing Gabby to leave him. But once Miriam brings Dan and Gabby together after the challenge, Gabby apologizes to Dan for leading him to the trap, and Gabby thanks Dan for at least acknowledging her feelings towards his betrayal. When Miriam pitches voting for Gret, Dan still expresses concern with having Tom on his side again, considering his betrayal back in episode 3. However, Dan realizes that although siding with someone who betrayed him isn't a logical move, he understands that he needs to earn Gabby's trust back, and that this can be done by voting for Gret. Thus, Gret still gets voted out, and Dan exits the episode feeling a bit more fulfilled, knowing that he made a move that was somewhat emotional, and it didn't immediately backfire on him. Now in canon, this episode contains Dan's elimination, so this episode needs to wrap up Dan's story to some degree. This episode will probably deviate the most from canon, but it won't change the major events that happen. The episode starts similarly to canon, with Dan and Gabby elated that they're back on the same side. Perhaps Dan even makes a confessional about how it felt good to make a decision based on emotion. Following this, Ellie joins the Teal team, just like in canon. However, instead of Dan viewing Ellie as the next target like he did in canon, Dan is happy that Ellie is on the team. This is because he knows that Ellie is close with Gabby, so as long as he sticks with Gabby and Ellie, he'll have 3 votes covered. This admission combines Dan's logical side of wanting the numerical advantage, with the emotional side of enjoying Gabby's company. We would have to include a scene of Dan, Gabby, and Ellie agreeing to an alliance, which I think would be good to include for Dan's story. However, just because Dan isn't targeting Ellie anymore, that doesn't mean that Ellie is safe. Instead, Miriam is the one that decides to target Ellie, due to her status as the new player on the team. And since Miriam and Dan worked together in the previous episode, Miriam asks Dan to join her, Jake, and Tom to form a majority against Ellie. This makes Dan feel conflicted, since he just made amends with Gabby and on a personal level, he doesn't want to betray her again. And once the Teal team loses the next challenge, Dan is put in an even further bind when Miriam presses him for an answer. This is where things get a bit weird because we know that Dan has to get eliminated. Gabby still needs to use her immunity totem, but I also don't want to have Dan betray Gabby and Ellie, since that would pretty much erase all the development he's had up to this point. So this is the solution that I have. Dan would pitch Jake as a new target, since his head isn't fully in the game anymore, but Miriam would refuse. And when she does, Dan decides to agree, but then quickly offers to distract Gabby and Ellie so that Miriam can tell Jake and Tom about the plan. However, what Dan is really doing is warning Gabby and Ellie about Miriam's plan, prompting Gabby to reveal that she has an immunity totem, and that if she plays it on Ellie, then all the votes on Ellie will be cancelled, and they can use their 3 votes to take out Miriam. Dan is okay with this, since he enjoys Gabby and Ellie's company more than the other 3 on his team. However, the issue with this is that since Dan hasn't shown himself to be the slyest guy in the world, when he offers to distract Gabby and Ellie immediately after agreeing to the plan to take out Ellie, Miriam would get perceptive and consider the possibility of Dan being loyal to Gabby, and thus, correctly consider that Dan is warning Gabby about her plan, and potentially planning a totem play to blindside someone in her alliance. So, to counter the possibility of Gabby playing a totem on Ellie, a counter plan is formed with Miriam convincing Tom and Jake to join her in voting for Dan. Her reasoning is that if Dan is not on her side, then they could end up in a 3-3 tie, forcing a tiebreaker. And since Dan has shown that he's physically weak, and also not in a position to do puzzles thanks to his broken glasses, he's probably the easiest to beat in a tiebreaker. And if Miriam is wrong and Dan is still loyal, then it's not a huge loss. The vote would be 3-2 Dan would go home, and Miriam's alliance would still hold a 3-2 advantage over Gabby and Ellie. And I don't think Tom and Jake would be against voting for Dan. After all, Tom canonically told Miriam to tell him who to vote for, so Tom would probably take Miriam's advice and vote for Dan. As for Jake, we know that he didn't want to vote for Ellie due to their mutual kindness in this episode, and since he and Dan don't really have that closeness, Jake might not mind voting for Dan in this case. Therefore, the votes play out as follows. Dan, Gabby, and Ellie stick together and vote for Miriam, with Gabby playing her immunity totem on Ellie thanks to Dan's warning. However, thanks to Miriam's counter plan, Gabby's totem is flushed as the other alliance votes for Dan, forcing a 3-3 tie between Miriam and Dan, necessitating a tiebreaker. And thanks to Season 3, we know that the tiebreaker is supposed to be the jailbreak challenge. And although Dan is a decently smart guy, he might not be able to accurately reach the key due to his broken glasses. And considering that part of Miriam's story arc is showing everyone that she's still capable of doing amazing things despite her age, having her win this tiebreaker is a great way to reinforce the idea that Miriam is stronger than people give her credit for. Thus, Miriam wins the tiebreaker, eliminating Dan. Gabby is left upset by this result, but Dan assures her that it will be alright. Dan thanks Gabby and Ellie for opening his eyes to a new way of thinking, and encourages them to stick together no matter what. This allows Dan to leave, satisfied that he was able to build genuine bonds, despite originally planning on using only logic to win. And that brings an end to Dan's new storyline for the season. I'll admit it's probably not the most exciting storyline ever, but I feel like it's at least more than what he got in canon. And even if it's marginally more than what he got in canon, I feel like every moment that he has in this timeline at least contributes to his character arc in some way. I don't think this storyline would make him very popular, since I get the impression that people in the Disventure Camp community don't really like game buddy characters. So I feel like if Dan were to be portrayed this way, he might end up being perceived similarly to Jade from Season 4. But honestly, that's probably a better perception than what he has in canon. I still think a lot could have been done with Dan's story, and a part of me still hopes that they bring him back for some sort of villain arc. But honestly, that hope will probably remain a dream forever. And that about does it for this video. Do you agree with my storyline? Do you disagree? What moments would you include to give Dan an improved storyline? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you very much for watching. Click like if you like the video, click subscribe if you really like the video, and for some ending words of wisdom. If you wear eyeglasses and you're going on a trip, always bring a spare pair of glasses with you, because you never know when you might accidentally break the ones you usually use. Thank you, and farewell.